17 years ago, our next speaker first graced this stage. He's been here 3 times since. If this were SNL, we'd be giving him a 5-timer jacket. Every time he speaks, and I can predict it will also be like this today, he exudes a sense of excitement. He makes everybody who hears him want to go off and change the world. And in fact, it's that sense of urgency and that enthusiasm and excitement that he brought to the book that he has just published, Big Bets: How Large-Scale Change Really Happens. He wrote this book on the basis of his work at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, both in the health group and as director of agriculture development, as administrator of USAID, and now as president of the Rockefeller Foundation. So I think today's comments are more like a guidebook for how to change the world. And who better to hear from than Dr. Rajiv Shah.
Thank you, Catherine, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a thrill to be with you. Catherine is, in addition, of course, to being the World Food Prize laureate from 2003, an extraordinary leader, a mentor, and friend, and the person who asked me to first come to this extraordinary meeting. Dr. Ronnie Kaufman and the whole World Food Prize Foundation team, thank you for having us. And I look forward to the conversation we're going to have. I was lucky to meet Dr. Norman Borlaug in that very first visit here in 2006. And Catherine, Dr. Borlaug, and myself were having a panel discussion, after which Dr. Borlaug said, "Raj, I want to meet with you privately in my room." And I said, "Okay, of course. Why? How could you say no?" I was honored that he even asked. And later that afternoon, I went up in the hotel up to his room, and he explained to me that the mission that had been his life's work and continued to be his life's work was now all of our responsibility. That we had it within our power to continue to advocate for and invest in proven strategies that can change agriculture, change communities, and ultimately conquer hunger. And although he was in his 90s at the time, he had no shortage of energy and no shortage of persistence in advocating for the simple idea, his big bet, that if we all work together, harness science and harness knowledge, we can in fact end hunger. And that's been the mission that we've all been on together. I'm proud of the fact that between 2001 and 2017, hunger globally did in fact get reduced considerably from 13% of the global population to 7.5% of the global population. That happened despite the fact that after the 2008 food, fuel, and financial crisis, 100 million people were pushed back into a state of hunger and then pulled out again by real initiatives like Feed the Future and others that have made a tremendous difference in the lives of so many families around the world. But the challenge before us is that hunger today is on the rise. It's up to 9%, north of 9% now of the global population. Once again, 760 million people are considered significantly undernourished. Coverage of the programs, policies, and investments that work are lowest where they're needed most. And because of climate change, the very real predictions are that by 2050, we'll be back north of 13, 14, 15% of the world's population being hungry again if we take our eye off the ball. And you know why this is the case. You know that after COVID-19, many more were pushed into food insecurity. You know that inflationary spirals like the one we are in right now have driven the costs of inputs and ultimately food far higher in communities that don't have the cushion in terms of disposable income to spend on food. And you know that instability anywhere around the world creates challenges. But of course, the driver of the biggest single challenge is climate change. Extreme weather events like droughts, floods, and hurricanes and heat waves are putting real downward pressure on agricultural productivity growth in the United States and in more industrial economies, and are actually decreasing production and productivity in many other parts of the world. So we have to rethink how we are going to reimagine Dr. Borlaug's challenge to us all going forward. And I'd like to suggest 3 potential big bets that we might make together as we do so. The first is around production. You just heard Secretary Vilsack offer a very clear explanation for how America crafted a policy framework to drive up productivity and production. But we know when he asks us to think broader, he's actually asking us to think about different types of production models that are far more climate sensitive. Regenerative agriculture, deep regenerative agriculture, agricultural systems that are seriously focused on socio-cultural outcomes in addition to biophysical outcomes, that are seriously measuring the impact on soil health, biodiversity, water, and even the nutritional profile of foods that are produced and consumed. We know it can take inspiration from the Andhra Pradesh Community-Managed Natural Farming Project, which is the largest transition to agroecology in the world, involving 6 million farmers and 8 million hectares, serving 50 million consumers in India. These farmers have seen an increase of 11% on average on their yields in primary crops, and a 44% reduction in input costs to allow them in total to more than double their net income. Those are the types of solutions that we hope to invest in through the Foundation's Regen 10 program, which hopefully will allow companies around the world to come together and shift a much greater share, as much as 50% of their supply chains, to deep regenerative agricultural models. And we hope they will make some of those commitments at this year's climate negotiations in Dubai. The second big bet is around consumption. And this is an area where I think sometimes we are far too timid in thinking about the solutions that are really necessary to address hunger at scale. The Foundation and our partners at the World Food Program and elsewhere have focused on school feeding programs as of late in an effort to reach the 730 million children who attend school, only about 420 million of which get any sort of school feeding, and probably less than half of that group gets anything that approximates a truly nutritious school meal. Where we have helped partners introduce fortified whole grains, introduce real dietary diversity, and have extra food to take back to their families, we've seen school attendance skyrocket, we've seen nutrition standards improve, and we've seen learning outcomes significantly go up. Roy Steiner, the Foundation's lead for food and agriculture, was in Paris just a week ago at the School Meals Coalition, where 90 countries and 50 partner organizations came together with an actual plan to reach 73 million additional vulnerable children with school meals, to improve everyone in a national school feeding program gets a proper level of basic nutrition, and to begin to introduce measures to measure both the production impacts and the nutrition profile of school feeding broadly. I'll say from my time at USAID and working on disasters, I think we are far too underinvested in feeding programs and consumption-oriented programs that can both create a floor for producers and target communities that will benefit greatly as consumers. The third big bet is the work Catherine advises the Foundation and does with the Rockefeller Foundation these days, which is looking at the extraordinary challenge of our immediate humanitarian food and support operations and trying to come up with ways where that business structure globally can be more efficient, more effective, and more tailored to long-term food security. It's in fact true that most, especially donor countries, spend far more on dealing with emergency response than they do investing in long-term agriculture. And if we don't get serious about using that investment to actually bridge the gap, we're going to continue to look at a world where hunger is going up and not down. So those are the three big bets the Rockefeller Foundation will stay committed to in the years ahead. We, as always, look forward to partnering and working with all of you. And I look forward to a conversation with Catherine, who is someone I just so deeply admire as the most passionate, most effective hunger fighter I've known over my time working on this issue. Thank you. For Catherine. She'll come, she always does.
Thanks, Raj.
Thank you.
I think you're supposed to sit on that one.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Raj. Big Bets. Here's the book. I'm helping to promote how large-scale change really happens. So would love to talk to you about some of those big bets, and especially from your three hats that you talk about in this book. But one thing I think that's very interesting that people might appreciate is some of your passion. Where does it come from? You talk about some of this, and I think before we talk about how that passion plays out, Raj, when you were 17, you were very motivated to do this work. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, I write in the book, Catherine, about my own childhood. I grew up in suburban Detroit, not in an agricultural community for sure. In fact, my dad worked at Ford Motor Company for more than 30 years. And I was on my path to either be an engineer or a doctor because, in case you cannot tell, I'm Indian American by background, and that's what my parents sort of suggested were the two options. And then, when I was 17, Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and of all places came to Detroit, Michigan. And we didn't get visitors like that in Detroit. I mean, it was amazing. And he went to the River Rouge plant, which is an assembly line where the integrated assembly line was sort of invented. He went to Tiger Stadium, was introduced by Stevie Wonder. It was a big Motown moment. And he concluded every one of his speeches by saying, to the people of Detroit, I have a message from you from the people of South Africa. We admire you, we respect you, but above all, we love you. And honest to God, I think it was the first time I heard a public leader talk about love. And it just blew me away, and I thought, okay, I'm never gonna be like Nelson Mandela, but I wanna do something of service with my life. And then I spent a lot of time trying to figure that out, sometimes successfully, some mostly unsuccessfully, until I was older. But that's sort of that was the spark.
Till you were older, like 30.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I know you'll do much more, but you've made it so far.
Okay, thank you, if you say so.
And really made a difference. So Norman Borlaug, let's talk about Dr. Borlaug, because he is so much of the basis of both the food price and the Rockefeller Foundation, as you mentioned. And so much of the work that we do is now based on the work that he did, and you give him a big shout out in the book. Few people have done more to improve local farming conditions than Dr. Norman Borlaug. We know from our own experience that farmers have so many different variables. Every day is different, every hour is different, whether it's the temperature or the weather in general, or the prices of whatever it is they want to sell, or their workers, or anything else related to it. And we also know that farming changes. So it would be great if you could talk about that legacy of Dr. Borlaug, but what kind of changes have happened since his important work that we now need to accommodate and work with?
Well, I'm thrilled to talk about that because, of course, Dr. Borlaug created the breakthrough technologies and then put so much effort with other leaders like M.S. Swaminathan, who, of course, just recently passed, at making sure that those ideas that could drive production were taken up everywhere they needed to be taken up. And the energy he put into taking seeds abroad, sometimes in manner that wouldn't meet every regulatory approval process, was really extraordinary, right? And it was advocacy at its very best. And it, of course, changed the world, moved 1 billion people off the brink of hunger, and has to be looked back on as a tremendous success. And at the same time, we know today that that form of agriculture, what Tom Vilsack called planting fence row to fence row with the sole drive on singular staple crop production, is not adequately taking into account our water resources, which are limited and need to be carefully stewarded. Perhaps not measuring outcomes related to soil health and the ability of the soils to be rich and nutrient rich and sequester carbon in particular. We know that large-scale animal operations, if that's the only way to produce protein over time, also, as Tom said, are simply going to create an environmental consequence that we have to understand today is unacceptable. And Dr. Borlaug at his heart was a scientist. So I don't think he would have, and others will speak to this, I'm sure, with more authority, but looking at the science today, he would, I think, have a very different perspective about what the world needs for the next 30 years. It needs a much more climate-smart agriculture. It needs much more diversity. It needs much more focus on the nutritional quality of the food being produced once you get to certain basic calories consumed. We now know so much about safety nets and how important they are, and yet they're so underinvested in that, without the Black Sea Grain Initiative, or even with the initiative, we saw these huge movements in the number of people who are vulnerable and hungry. The science around infant and young child feeding, which you've been such an extraordinary global leader on, simply didn't exist at that time. So we need a much more science-based approach to fighting hunger and doing it in a climate-smart way.
Great, thank you. Another father of ours, collectively, at the Rockefeller Foundation and here at the symposium was Sir Gordon Conway. And we salute him and his recent, all his work, but also his recent passing. But perhaps you could say a few words about what you've learned from Sir Gordon.
Honestly, what I learned from Gordon is what I've learned from you as well. It's just passion and kindness and intelligence applied over and over and over again to make a difference in the world. What Gordon, I think, was so proud of in his professional work when he was president of the Rockefeller Foundation and beyond was understanding and trying to identify models for, he called it so many different things, a doubly green revolution, an evergreen revolution, a much more sustainable form of agricultural production that could be studied in all its different forms and would help lift up the producers, help lift up the consumers from a nutritional perspective, and first and foremost, be a far more efficient way to use the collection of natural resources required to produce food. And he was a scientist until the end, right? He just kept seeking those new models that would reinvigorate our capacity to fight hunger, but to do it in a much more truly green way in the context of a climate-challenged world.
Right. He was very special. I know everybody who knew him agrees. Well, let's get back into the potential big bets around nutrition and safety nets. You've spoken a bit about this already. We found out recently from both IFPRI and the University of Bonn, when they actually were able to study the impact of the price increases during the last food price crisis in 2008 to 2011, that the impact on stunting was very significant for children. And it reminded us how important this population is, and also, I think, enticed us to do more for this population. The school feeding programs that you talked about that are so important are critically important to not only have children go to school, learn in school, but also succeed in life. The combination of those two efforts to reach the babies, really, and to reach school children is critically important. Can you give us a few more thoughts about how we can move in the direction of having universal feeding for both babies and children?
Well, I think first, as you point out, the science supporting the importance of those safety nets and other types of safety nets as well is so proven at this point in terms of those are the most effective ways to support vulnerable populations. And we should expect many more episodes of food, fuel, financial crises or variability that puts downward pressure on vulnerable communities in particular from a hunger and nutrition perspective. So then you have to say, well, are we investing that way? And I had the great honor of running USAID for so many years. And the truth is, we're not investing that way, right? Most of our resources, even resources that are tagged to fight hunger, are not going to infant and young child feeding, are not going to school feeding, are not informed by science-based targeted feeding that's tethered to measuring nutrition outcomes at scale. And America is still 50% or maybe 40% of the total global effort on humanitarian food assistance. I think the way to reinvigorate this effort is to build a broad political coalition and to make sure that that political coalition is led by local leaders. So I was just in Kenya with President Ruto, who has really committed to this effort, and he's visited schools where improving both the quality and quantity of school feeding has increased attendance 150% amongst girls right outside of Kibera, not far from Nairobi, in Nairobi. And we can replicate that over and over and over again. So, it would be easy to step back and say, well, gosh, official development assistance to Africa has gone down each of the last 2 years. And in that environment, can we even imagine doing big things together again? But on the flip side, if we don't do this, we are so much more vulnerable going forward because of climate change and because of real fragility in the global food system that I think the time has to be now to reinvigorate an effort specifically around safety nets.
Great. When you were here in 2006, your first time, you were the new director of agriculture development for Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And you came with a series of questions to the audience about how best the foundation get into this work in agriculture. And that is where most of us, me included, met you and began our relationships. So a couple of questions about this. First of all, when you left Gates to go work for Tom Vilsack in the administration, were you pleased about what you had accomplished? And can you tell us a little bit about why? And the second question related to that is that one of the things that many of us noticed that you did do was to say, no matter what the Gates Foundation puts into agriculture development, governments need to do much more. So do you feel like they have?
Well, I was pleased when I left Gates in that time, 2009, because in a 3-4 year window with your support, we had stood up a new program, right, in agriculture. We had created a prominent, locally owned, locally run organization in AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution for Africa. And we had probably invigorated a dozen or so major collaborations around research and science that were driving more funding to the CGIAR partners all around the world, and we're about to honor an Erie-based recipient. But we had also, done all of that at your insistence and appropriate insistence in a way that was really focused on measuring outcomes for women and girls in particular, and understanding that most farmers and most farm labor comes from women. So that I was very proud of. In retrospect, I wish I had understood back then the role of safety net thinking and studied more the structures of safety nets, because we, in that day, thought of, okay, infant and young child, that's really a health program. And school feeding, that's really an education program. And I don't think in that era we ever fully kind of brought it all together in a way that could really be effective at tackling hunger at scale everywhere. I still think the governments have to be the lead funders of this work for a lot of reasons. When we created Feed the Future under President Obama, we went basically from zero funding to $1 billion, $1.1 billion. I was just with my former colleagues at USAID, and I said, what's the current budget number for Feed the Future? And it's still 1.1 billion. And I'm like, or maybe 1 or 1.2. These things, when you have proven programs that are measuring results, that are documenting impact, that are creating a floor for people and communities so they don't go hungry when you have bad weather events or global price shocks, we should be driving more investment into those efforts. And it should be 5 times that, just on behalf of the US government, and then all the other governments should be doing a lot more too. So no, I don't think at all we are meeting the moment in terms of adequate public investment. And it's not okay to just be stuck where we were a decade ago. We have to rethink and reimagine the future. And I look at this data around what effectively climate change is going to do to the fight against hunger globally. And it's shocking. It's shocking. It basically wipes out decades of work unless we reinvigorate the fight. And that has to start with politics. It has to start with building a bipartisan coalition around this. It has to, which, by the way, there are leaders who want to do this together. But it has to be much more, much richer, much more energetic, and much more oriented around the threat that's coming.
Much more to do, but also credit to you for having started this conversation with the US government about much more that they need to do. I mean, you said during your Gates time, no matter what Gates Foundation puts in, governments have to do more, and let's work with the US government to try to do that. So shout out to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and many people who are here who were part of that they put together a program with a grant from Gates, which became ultimately Feed the Future, because you switched hats and went then to first to USDA and then to USAID.
Yeah, it's all the same people and wearing with different seats on the train at different points in time. And those programs, but I'd say even there's one thing to do the design and the kind of scientific basis for how to do those types of programs. And if you don't, there's a Feed the Future booth outside, and I was just looking through the impact report, and it's so structured and documented in terms of the actual outcomes, which is fantastic. But to me, the big learning when I was in government was the political part. The idea that this could actually be in a tough political context. This could be an area where there was real cooperation across progressives and very conservative Republicans, and then middle of the road on both parties. And a lot of that required deep personal engagement that ranged from visiting science labs together on university campuses across this country to traveling with Lindsey Graham wherever he wanted to travel, which is usually Clemson, and joining the Senate prayer breakfast and understanding how hunger carries a different level of moral and ethical and real commitment for certain members of Congress in a way that's just different from other things we talk about. So I believe, based on those experiences, we can hold hands and get this done again, but it starts with real political leadership.
Right, and it's important, as you said, to have that be bipartisan, which you really, and you talked about that also in your book, that you learned the hard way that was important, but then you learned it very well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What Catherine's referring to is I testified once that a Republican budget called H.R. 1 by Paul Ryan and Speaker Boehner would effectively have zeroed out a lot of USAID programs. And I went up to Congress with a sort of spreadsheet in hand and explained how 70,000 kids would die because we'd take down malaria and vaccine and mother-child transmission programs for HIV/AIDS. And when I got back to my office, it was Tom Vilsack who called me and said, listen, I'm sure a lot of people are congratulating you for how tough you just were. But I was with the Speaker of the House, and Speaker Boehner is quite upset with the way you said that, and you should go visit with him. And so I did, and I apologized, and he gave me a list of members to get to know. And out of that grew some extraordinary friendships with people like Jim Inhofe, who I never would have otherwise connected with, and who became an extraordinary partner through my time in government. And by the way, the Global Food Security Act has been reauthorized twice since that time in 2015 when it was passed, most recently around the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So I still think America carries this special moral purpose around the fight on hunger. I think there's a strong bipartisan effort there. but I do think we have to be much more ambitious about really leading in the fight on hunger for the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Now, you are about to go to talk to the Youth Institute. So before we finish this conversation, maybe you should give us, not so young people, a background, a few quick points that you would suggest that we use in our effort to make big change.
Well, last week, as part of the book tour, I had a chance to visit the Chicago Agricultural High School. And for those of you that haven't been there, it is just one of the most special places in the world. And these kids are amazing. And some of them are going to be at this institute later today. I'm about to sit with them and hear about their projects. And they said, well, how do you think about actually solving these problems? And my big thing was, well, it starts by actually trying to solve these problems at scale. Like, it's not okay to fall into this, what I call in the book, an aspiration trap, because we read the news, we look at our politics, our house doesn't have a speaker, and we say, my goodness, in that environment, how are we going to solve hunger globally? It would be easy to let go of the challenge. And the first thing you have to do is be an optimist and say, let me work on the big problem. How do we prevent 1.2, 1.3 billion people from being hungry in 2050? Start working on that today. The second thing is to keep focusing on innovation and solutions. I mean, you asked about Gordon Conway. That was Gordon's special sauce, right? It was like he was always kind of looking for what's the next micro innovation? What can I learn from a farmer in this community, in this part of the world? And learn with such authenticity and intensity of respect for the communities that he was serving. So you got to keep looking for that. And then my big focus is we all have to be better at bringing partners together, measuring results and staying focused. Like, you know, Democrats can't just do this in Democratic administrations. Republicans can't just do it in Republican ones. Scientists can't be separated from political leaders. You know, university science-based professors should be working with corporate leaders and figuring this out together. And so I tell these kids, like, be the person who can bring everyone together. Like, even if that means you go to in your early career, go to different parts of the economy to get experiences, but be the kind of person who can talk to a Republican senator, a corporate leader, and a really smart scientist, you know, because it's the synthesis of all that that gets you, you know, the kinds of achievements we celebrate at the World Food Prize.
Well, Raj, I think today we appreciate very much all of your comments and being here for the 5th time. And before we move on to the next part of the program, may I say on behalf of everybody, we appreciate not only your coming to join us, we appreciate your putting together some of your thoughts in this book, but we especially appreciate your innovative, strong, thoughtful, creative leadership, because you clearly have made a big impact on our world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine.